Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Thanks so much for coming. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Mike Grobbel, president of the Michigan Polar Bear Association. Mike was planning on coming to Rockford, the Rockford branch of the Kent District Library, to do a joint program with the Rockford Area Historical Society last spring. But of course, history, the COVID epidemic got in the way. So he's kind enough to be joining us virtually today. And like I said, he's president of the Michigan Polar Bear Association. So for those of you who don't know, the Michigan Polar Bears was the popular name given to the 5,000 fresh recruits who formed the American North Russian Expeditionary Forces, most of whom were from Michigan, and they were formed and sent to fight the Bolsheviks just months after the armistice that ended World War I. So Mike hails from the Detroit area, and he's the grandson of a Michigan polar bear, and he has worked to keep their memory alive and to tell the story. So thank you so much, and welcome, Mike.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity here to share this Michigan story with everyone who's tuned in. The American North Russian Expeditionary Force consisted of about 5,000 men, mostly from Michigan, and primarily from the southeastern portion of Michigan, who found themselves not going to the Western Front, but going to North Russia. And I'm here today to give you an overview and to help tell their story. So if I could have the first slide, please. As mentioned, I'm president of the Polar Bear Memorial Association. We're just a loose collection of relatives and friends of people who knew some of the polar bears. And we work every Memorial Day to have a program at Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan to honor their dead. And I'll show you some photos later on about that. First, I'd like to talk about a little background. How did they end up in Russia? But in order to explain that, you really need to go back a little bit to June of 1914, when what was called the Great War, we know it now as World War I, but they called it the Great War. It was triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Austria. Next. The next slide shows a map of Europe. What started out as a regional conflict because of all the interlocking treaties between the great powers of Europe quickly turned into a bloodbath. And the Central Powers were aligned against the Allied powers. The Allied powers consisted of France, Great Britain, and originally Italy, but they later switched sides. And they were aligned against the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. So you can see there on my map a small red arc in France. That's approximately the location and length of the Western Front, which we're most familiar with. But we need to remember and understand that Russia was also an ally with the Allied powers, and they fought the Central Powers on the Eastern Front. And it was that fact that the Central Powers had to fight on two separate fronts, which made it much more difficult for them and much more difficult for the folks in Russia, because they weren't able to get a lot of supplies to help wage that war. Next slide. A lot of the supplies that they did get from the U.S. and Great Britain came by the northern ports of Archangel and later Murmansk. So they were able to continue fighting during those first few years of the war. But at the same time, there was a great deal of social unrest in Russia. People were chafing under the high taxes and the poor living conditions under the Tsar's wartime austerity programs. And the socialists were fomenting revolution and eventually forced the Tsar to abdicate. So here's the Free Press, Detroit Free Press, from March 15th, 1917, announcing that the Tsar finally had abdicated and the Russian rebels had won. Now, these weren't the communists. These were another set of socialists, and they formed a government under the name of a man called Nicholas Kerensky. It was a provisional government, and they took control after a few days of battles. So at this point, the Russian Tsar is no longer in the picture, and there's a socialist government in control. Next. The U.S. had tried to stay out of the war, but eventually the conditions grew more and more dire, not only for the soldiers and countries of France and Great Britain, but we also got brought in by some of the manipulations of the German government, including the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram. And that swung the tide of public opinion, and eventually Congress made a declaration of war on April 6, 1917, and we entered the war on the side of the Allied powers. As you'll note also in the headline on the far left, it says, Wilson approves a conscript bill. At the time, the U.S. had the 6th largest standing army in the world, right after number 5, Belgium. We had about 125,000 soldiers who were available to us, nowhere near what would be needed to fight this war. So Congress had to approve a draft. So this was on April 6th, and by June 5th, on the next slide, you'll see that announcements were out that all men between the ages of 21 and 31 had to register for the draft on June 5th, 1917. And an amazing feat, 10.5 million men were registered on that single date across the entire United States. It was still contentious in some areas that we were entering the war. There were a lot of threats of violence from fringe groups to disrupt this registration process, but the veterans of the Spanish-American War volunteered to keep the peace in the various cities that had the most unrest. So in terms of Michigan, the only place where there was any bit of a flare-up occurred in the Upper Peninsula and the Keweenaw area, where there was a lot of opposition to this. But other than that, it went off pretty peacefully for a feat of getting 10.5 million to sign their registration cards on a single day. Next slide. Well, at the same time now, they're drafting all these men to fight the war. They have to have a place to train them. And obviously they didn't have enough existing barracks and facilities, so they had to build cantonments. That's what they called these training camps. And the one for our region in the Great Lakes was built in Battle Creek, and it was called Camp Custer. And on August 25th, 1917, the 1st Division to be organized and trained at Camp Custer was called the 85th Division, and the nickname was the Custer Division, after General Custer, who was a native of Monroe, Michigan. So you can see in a short time, from April to August, a lot of activity took place. The 85th included 4 infantry regiments, the 337th, 338th, 339th, and the 340th infantry regiments. And then it also included the 310th Engineers and some supporting companies. The 339th was primarily consisted of men from southeast Michigan, and as a result, they took to calling themselves Detroit's Own. That was the nickname given by themselves to themselves, and it was popularly picked up in the press. So that's how they got their first nickname, was because of the preponderance of men from southeast Michigan in that infantry regiment. Next slide. This is a photo taken inside of one of the barracks. The Daughters of the American Revolution would come to Camp Custer at least once a week to darn the men's socks and clothing. So you can see this is a posed picture of the ladies from the local Daughters of the American Revolution chapter doing some knitting and mending of socks. In November of 1917, that provisional government that I mentioned earlier that was headed by Nicholas Kerensky, it was deposed. So the Russians and the Soviet Union always celebrated their October Revolution. Well, that was in late October, according to their calendar. By our calendar, the revolution that took place was on November 7th, 1917. So this is when the communists took over, and Kerensky was thrown to the curb. And you can see the Port Huron Times article headline here. The one that's a subhead circled in gold. You need to go to the next slide, please. Yeah, the subhead there says Civil War facing Russia is indicated. And that was a very, very prescient observation, because that's exactly where the 339th would find themselves in within the next 8 months. Next slide. The primary objective of the newly formed communist government was to get out of the war. The war was terribly unpopular. Under the provisional government, the Tsar's army basically refused to fight. So there was hardly any fighting going on during 1917 on the Eastern Front. And in March of 1918, when the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty with Germany, that officially ended all the fighting on the Eastern Front. And this greatly alarmed the British, the French, and particularly because they were concerned now that Germany would be able to bring numerous numbers of divisions towards the Western Front to begin an offensive as soon as the weather improved in 1918. And they appealed to the U.S. to hurry up and get the men over here to help us, because the training was taking quite a long time because of the need to build new camps and everything else. So things were coming to a head. 1918 was going to be a pivotal year because there was now only a one-front war, and the British and French armies had basically been decimated in the previous 3 years. Next slide. It was on July 11th, 1918, when Camp Custer said goodbye to the 85th Division. It took them that long, from August of 17 to July of 1918, to acquire their full strength of 30,000 soldiers. It took them 70 trains over 7 days to transfer all those men and equipment from Battle Creek to New York so that it could board the troop ships. Next slide. So 6 days later, after they started to leave Camp Custer, President Wilson finally bows to the pressure that he'd been getting from the French and British diplomats to agree to send a limited number of men to North Russia. He really didn't want to do it. He didn't want to take the focus away from getting the needed manpower to the Western Front. And he was very, very reluctant, and he went against the advice of his Secretary of War and his Secretary of State, but made the commitment. And basically it was done without any fanfare, without any publicity. He just typed his own memo up in his upstairs office at the White House, outlining what he wanted to achieve by sending this limited number of troops. And basically his instructions were they're to go up there to protect all this Allied military stores that had been sent to the Tsar's army and were still in the warehouses in Archangel. There was also a group of stranded soldiers who were allied with the Allied powers, but they were stranded in Russia after the end of fighting, and they wanted to get to the Western Front, but they couldn't get through Germany and Austria. So the plan was to send this group called the Czech Legion through Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and then put them on ships in the Pacific to bring them to France. And they were stuck. They were trying to get through the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they would have to fight their way at various stations to fight the communist troops who saw them as enemies. So the idea was maybe they could bring them out through North Russia. So that was the second point. And of course, the third point was put new soldiers in there to keep the German army divisions on the Eastern Front so they would not be transferred to the Western Front. So those were his instructions. What he forgot, though, was that a few months previous, he had already agreed that all operations in North Russia would be under the command of the British Army and the British Navy. Next slide. General Pershing received those orders, and with knowing which divisions were where during the month of July, and which ones were committed, which ones were headed where, he made the decision, he and his staff, that the 85th Division, the fact that they were still in the mid-Atlantic, would be the right place to look for these men who would go to North Russia. So he made the decision that to send one of the infantry regiments, the 339th, to go to North Russia, and to send the rest of the 85th to their original destination, which would be the Western Front. And he gave the name, the American North Russia Expeditionary Force, to these 5,000 soldiers who had been identified. Next slide. The 5,000 men consisted of the 339th Infantry Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 310th Engineers, along with a field hospital company and an ambulance company. And when they arrived in Liverpool, they were sent to a separate camp different from the rest of the 85th. And all their weapons and clothing were taken away, and they were given new issues of British-made equipment. Even though they matched the American uniforms, they were more of a cold weather gear. They were given new rifles because in Russia, the cartridges that rifle used was in plentiful supply by both sides. So they had to relearn how to shoot with those Mosin Nagant rifles, and also how to shoot with Lewis and what's the other one? There were two different types of British machine guns: the Lewis gun, which was air cooled, and the Vickers, which was water cooled. And one thing they learned quickly: water cooled machine guns don't work very well in the North Arctic. But they hadn't learned that lesson yet. On August 25th, after 3 weeks of training and refitting, they were sent to Newcastle on Tyne, where they boarded these 3 troop ships, the Somali, the Titius, and the Nagoya. And they arrived in Archangel on the 4th of September and disembarked the following day, the 5th. Next slide. What they didn't know, and soon learned, was 2 of the 3 ships had been previously used to transport Italian troops, and they had carried the Spanish influenza virus. So by the time the American troops arrived, there were men already on their deathbed, and they had to find hospitals to treat them in before they could unload them from the ships on September 5th. Within that first month of September, 60 of the 5,000 men were dead from the Spanish influenza. Hundreds more, the lucky ones, they were able to head out to their assigned posts out in the field, which actually saved them, and because they were outdoors, prevented the virus from spreading even more. Now, this map that I'm showing here shows in orange the outlines of the areas that the Allied troops ultimately would control in North Russia. The map represents about 600 miles from top to bottom. The orange area, at the most, they occupied areas along the river that was about 250 miles from Archangel along the river, and for about 100 miles south along the railroad front. Because the British were in command, as soon as the Americans landed, the American officers met with the British officers, and they were told that all the military supplies had been taken by the Bolsheviks. So there was no job for them to do guarding of military supplies. Therefore, they were given orders to go and chase the Bolos down the river and down the railroad front and engage them and see if they could get any of it back. So that's the term today. Today we use the term mission creep to describe what happened to them. They went up there with one set of orders, and no sooner had they landed, they had a completely different set of orders that included fighting the Russian Red Army, which was nowhere to be found in President Wilson's memorandum. In addition to the American troops up there, there was an equal number of Allied troops, primarily British, French, Canadian, along with some locally trained white Russian troops who, for the most part, had previously served in the Tsar's Imperial Army. Next. Here we have a photo taken in downtown Detroit on Woodward Avenue. You can see Hudson's department store in the background. Everyone was celebrating on the morning of November 11th, 1918. The armistice had been signed earlier that morning. And for most people, the Great War was over and they knew their boys would be coming home soon. But it wasn't over for all of them. Next slide. Because the Bolsheviks had signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers back in March of 1918, as far as they were concerned, that was when the war was over, and all these Allied troops now in Russia were enemies who were there to stomp out the Russian Revolution. So, as a result, nothing really changed for the men who were up there in North Russia. During the months of September and October, prior to the signing of the armistice, a significant amount of fighting took place along the railroad front. It took them about 6 weeks to push the Bolsheviks back to the south for a distance of about 100 miles. And ultimately, that became a stalemate in late October, so there was no further advancement. But on the river front, there were some significant battles, including one that took place on November 11th itself, which was up to then was that was the bloodiest battle that had been fought, and that was in the little village of Tulis. Another significant battle along the riverfront occurred in late January, and that was the beginning of the Red Army's attempt to go on the offense. Most of the fighting stopped during the winter time, and it was just occasional skirmishes and patrols. But once the Russians knew that there were no more Allied soldiers to be coming in because the ports were froze, they went on the offensive in January in an attempt to push the Americans, the British, the French, and the Canadians back to the White Sea. The final major battle occurred the first week of April at Bolshoy-Ozerki, and that one ended up in a draw because a warm front came through and began a thaw, and it turned all the forest trails to slush and mud. So each of the armies had to withdraw before they got trapped in the mud. So those are just a few of the major battles, but there was fighting going on every day. It's just that none of them may have escalated to the same level as the ones that I just identified here. Next slide. Here's an aerial view of Archangel taken in 1918 by the troops. You can see the Russian Orthodox cathedral off in the distance, dedicated to St. Michael the Archangel, which was the patron saint of Archangel. You can see some the port cranes there towards the right, off in the distance on the Dvinia River. And running down the middle of this photo is the main street, now known today as Troitsky Prospect. And you can see they had a streetcar line there, and there's a streetcar running down the middle of the street. It was a very cosmopolitan city of about 30,000, but because of the war conditions, the population was about double at the time the Americans arrived in September. Next slide. This is a photo of the Allied headquarters building that they had commandeered. It formerly had been a training institute. And there's a closer view of the streetcar on the main line. Interestingly enough, the day that the Americans disembarked, the streetcar workers went on strike for higher wages because of the inflation and lack of food because of the extreme increase in the population. So the British officers got in touch with the American officers and told them, find some men with streetcar experience and tell them to run the streetcars. So the American soldiers were used to break the strike Fortunately, they had a number of men who had worked for the Detroit Street Railways, and they were able to operate them for the next week or so until the workers came back. On the far right of this photo, you can see the outline of a Russian droshky. It's a small pony cart, usually with sled runners for the wintertime, and it's pulled by small Russian ponies. And that's the primary means of transport of the sick, wounded, as well as all the supplies, ammunition, and everything else that had to be taken to the front lines where the fighting was. So this is the typical view of what the men saw during the winter of 1918, 1919, when they were in Archangel. Next slide. The equipment that the men received in Britain, Great Britain, was supposed to be effective for fighting in Arctic climes, but it wasn't the best. A lot of the men decided to buy locally produced goods, including gloves and boots. The boots they had been given were designed by Sir Ernest Shackleton, who was a famous explorer of the South Pole regions. And the boots he designed, though, had slippery leather soles, suitable for the types of ice conditions you find at the South Pole, but unsuited for the types of snow and ice in the north of Russia. So the men quickly got rid of those, and a lot of them bought locally produced boots. So the local markets did a good business with the Americans once they arrived. Next slide. Top photo is a tent that was used as an airplane hangar. That was the responsibility of the 310th engineers to clear wooded areas and pull stumps and grade the land so that they could create runways for the British Army Air Force, which while they were up there was renamed the Royal Air Force. The other job was to keep the snow from collapsing the tents. So every morning they would have to go out there and brush it off so that they could get the airplanes out of the tent hangars. A lot of the men who wrote home described their wonderment of actually seeing live reindeer in Archangel. Reindeer aren't native to this area, but they are native to an area about 300 miles northeast of Archangel. And during the winter, for years and years and years, the Eskimos living in that area would bring their reindeer herds to Archangel to make money during the winter by providing taxi service across the frozen Davinia River, because Archangel was on the north embankment and the railroad line to Moscow ended on the south embankment. So this was a very profitable service that these folks provided, and you see many photos to this day that were taken and saved by the men up there posing with the reindeers at the taxi service on the river. Next slide. Here's a couple of photos taken on the railroad front at what they called verst 455. A verst is a unit of distance equal to about 2/3 of a mile, roughly a kilometer. So verst 455 was the headquarters for the Allies on the railroad front, and they had a number of railroad sidings there where they kept box cars. The men who weren't at the front lines would be kept and bunked in those box cars on the sidings here, and you can see a whole bunch of them there posed almost to completely cover the front of a wood-burning locomotive. Next slide. As I mentioned, the droshky pony carts were the main means of transport for providing supplies. In the upper left corner, you see a supply convoy heading along the Davinia riverfront to bring food and equipment and ammunition to the men at the front lines. One of the hardships of being at the front lines along the riverfront was that it was so long that by the time the supplies got to them, usually about 1/3 of it had been pilfered and sold on the black market. So they had to subsist on about 2/3 of the calories they were supposed to be getting. And to supplement that, a lot of them shot wild game and bartered with the local peasants for things like potatoes. I mentioned the 310th engineers. The men that were there, they weren't from the Detroit area. For the most part, they were from northern lower Michigan and from the Upper Peninsula. These were men who were very good with working with wood and timber, because that's what they had done back home. And the 310th Engineers ran a sawmill in Archangel to provide cut lumber for the other engineers then to build things like the blockhouse you see there, which the soldiers would retreat to when they were being attacked by artillery, because they could provide safer shelter there from flying shrapnel. Next slide. This is a photo taken on February 4th, 1919. The caption that was provided by the Signal Corps photographer stated that the previous night had been the coldest so far, with temperatures at 40 below zero. And oftentimes I'm asked, is that 40 below zero Fahrenheit or Celsius? And I did the math, and actually the two lines cross and meet each other when you graph it. So 40 below is the same cold temperature whether you measure it in Celsius or Fahrenheit. Some statistics there. A total of 230 men total out of the 5,000 lost their lives for various reasons from the time they left the United States till the time they returned. 152 of them were killed in action or died from their wounds. 72, a total of them, died from disease, primarily from influenza, pneumonia, and a few other types of diseases. 7 died from accidents. There was 1 suicide, so 6 accidental deaths, 1 suicide, and about 300 men who were wounded but survived and returned to their units. Next slide. At the same time, when that photo was being taken in February of 1919, the folks back home were getting antsy. They knew from the papers that the first soldiers from the Western Front were starting to arrive back home, and they're still getting letters 4 or 5 weeks old from their sons in North Russia who are telling them they're still fighting long after the armistice. So folks back home started writing letters to their congressmen, letters to the newspapers, to the editors, demanding that the boys be brought back from Russia because we're not at war with Russia. So why are they up there? And eventually some of the U.S. senators took up the cause, and the War Department announced in the 3rd week of February 1919 that the men in North Russia would be withdrawn at the earliest possible moment. Well, they didn't get more specific than that, but everybody in the Army knew that that first possible moment would probably be about 3 months away, because all the ports were locked up with ice and there was no other practical way to get the men out. So they would have to wait until the rivers froze and the port opened up in late May. So the petition drives that they had in Grand Rapids and also in Detroit, an example that you see here, ended up being very effective in drawing national attention to this obscure military intervention that occurred during that winter of 1918, 1919. Next slide. Another complication about withdrawing the men was that the British would need additional troops brought in to hold the positions occupied by the American troops. So they raised a volunteer force back in London of about 6,000 men to come up to Russia. And the first group of those arrived right around the last week of May 1919, which allowed the Americans then to begin bringing their companies out from the field and back to Archangel. On Memorial Day, May 30th, 1919, there was a large parade of the American troops and a ceremony that you see here honoring the American dead who were buried in the Allied cemetery in Archangel on that date. Next slide. Another view here showing the gunpowder smoke from the rifle volley given in tribute to the men who had died. Next slide. The first ship with American troops left Archangel for Brest, France on June 1st, 1919. My grandfather was one of the lucky ones. His company was aboard that ship. When they arrived in New York, they were met by the newspaper reporters from the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, who then chronicled their return the rest of the way, because the citizens of Detroit were planning a big extravaganza, a welcome home party for the American polar bears, as they call themselves now. And that party was going to be held on the 4th of July, 1919, on Belle Isle. So here you see the men as they are marching down to board the steamer on the morning of July 4th to take them to Belle Isle. Next slide. And this is what they saw when they got off the steamer. A big banner says, "Home at last, all Detroit welcomes her 339th heroes." And it's surrounded by images of polar bears, because the word had gotten back that that was the nickname they had adopted, along with a patch to be worn on their left shoulders. So this is how they got their name, polar bears. It was decided by the men themselves and approved by General Pershing. But the telegram with that approval did not arrive until the day after the first ship had left Archangel. So when those men arrived at Brest, they still weren't aware that it had been approved. So in the meantime, they had made up some shoulder patches that said NR for North Russia. So today you will still see some uniforms with the NR patch and other uniforms with the polar bear patch. And from that, you can deduce that the NR patch belonged to a soldier who came back on that first ship. Next slide. During the summer of 1919, the American Graves Registration Service came to Archangel and tried to recover as many of the American war dead as they could. But they still had to leave about half of them behind, many of which were buried in villages that were now behind the front lines and held by the Red Army. So they did the best they could. They got about half of them brought back in the summer of 1919, and then sent the bodies home to the families for burial in their local cemeteries. When the polar bears arrived home and they were all safely back home, they agreed they wanted to form their own association of veterans. So they organized in 1922 a group called the Polar Bear Association, with the primary objective of lobbying the state and federal government to get the rest of the bodies returned from North Russia. Unfortunately, the U.S. was not engaged in diplomatic relations. We didn't recognize the Soviet Union at the time, so that was a complicating factor. And the Russians, the first thing when the discussions would begin again, they would demand several shipments of wheat for their people to survive on in order to even talk about it. So those discussions went nowhere until 1929, when it was agreed to let a small group in under the leadership of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. So in 1929, a group of 8 men went back to North Russia. They had all the maps that had been made by the sergeants who had buried their men, and they were able to recover 86 more bodies in 1929. And additional bodies, another 14 were recovered in 1934. And that leaves 23 men whose remains have never been recovered, who could not be found and still are buried somewhere in Russian soil. And those are their names on the list here. Next slide. The photo you see here is the bodies lying in state, some of them that were brought back home in 1929, in 1919, and then, like I said, the additional bodies then were recovered in subsequent years. But since 1934, there have been no more remains identified or returned. Following the return of those 86 sets of remains in 1929, the Polar Bear Association raised the money to have a statue sculpted and placed in the Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. And on that Memorial Day of 1930, they reburied 45 of the men who had been killed in North Russia surrounding the monument at Whitechapel. And here you can see the parents of one of the dead folding the flag from the coffin of their son. About 10,000 people attended this ceremony that day. There were speeches by the governor of Michigan. It was broadcast live over WJR radio. And it was a very big deal, Memorial Day of 1930. Next slide. Okay, yeah, there's the photo of the parents. Next slide is the picture of the monument after its dedication. And that was taken a year or two after it was dedicated. You can tell because of the fact there's not many trees there. It's a much different view today. Next slide. Here's a recent photo taken of one of the Memorial Day ceremonies that our successor organization organizes. Like I said, I'm president of the Polar Bear Memorial Association. Our job is to organize and conduct the traditional Memorial Day service that was started back in May of 1930 by the Polar Bears. They wanted to make sure that Memorial Day service would continue long after the last of them had died. They felt that they had been forgotten by their government, and they did not want their buddies who had given their lives to be forgotten. So they collected money for a trust fund to keep the Memorial Day service going, but eventually that got depleted, and now it's a volunteer organization that keeps the tradition going, along with the support and assistance of the staff at Whitechapel Cemetery. Next slide. That concludes my telling of the story. It's a short telling of it. It doesn't do it justice, but if you're interested and you want to learn more, here's some additional resources that I can recommend to you. The Michigan Heroes Museum in Frankenmuth, Michigan, has the stories of about approximately 50 of the polar bear veterans. And when I describe a story, that consists of generally their uniform, the medals that they were awarded, and any other artifacts that they had brought back with them, along with a short biography, so that we can put these on display in a display case with their uniform on a mannequin, and a photo of the soldier, and a brief biography telling the story of that individual soldier. So you can see at any one time, usually 10 or 12 of the polar bears stories on display at the Michigan Heroes Museum. The founder of that museum had befriended a lot of the polar bear veterans in the late 1970s and helped them continue organizing their every other year reunions. So because he had helped them out, they made Stan Bozich an honorary member of the Polar Bear Association. So as part of his pact with them, he helped keep this Memorial Day ceremony alive over the years. Stan passed away a few years ago, and he's now buried next to the Michigan Historical Marker, just adjacent to the polar bear plot at Whitechapel. Another resource is the Bentley Historical Library on the North Campus of the University of Michigan. They have a large collection of diaries, scrapbooks, photos, maps, blue line construction details from the 310th Engineers, showing all the machine gun emplacements and blockhouses and everything that they built up there. So they've got quite a collection, and the good thing is about 95% of that has been scanned and is online and available for anyone to look at no cost through their website. Also, there's a similar website operated by the Sandusky, Michigan Library. It's from the collection of Moritz Eriksson and includes a lot of photos and typewritten manuscripts about the polar bears who served in North Russia. And the final resource is the website that I operate, pbma.grobbel.org, and I've got links to all those other resources from the site that I operate. Next slide. This is a photo of a part of the polar bear gallery at the Michigan Heroes Museum. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this, that's a good place to visit next time you're in Frankenmuth. It's on Weiss Street, about a quarter-mile north of Bronner's, on the back side street. It's not on the main street, so you have to look for Weiss Street. And not only do we have the story of the polar bears, this museum also has a gallery that tells the story of 29 Michigan recipients of the Medal of Honor. It's the largest such gallery in the world dedicated and displaying the actual awarded medals of our Medal of Honor recipients, and they're all from the state of Michigan. So I strongly encourage it. I'm a member of the board of directors at the museum, and invite you to visit. Next slide. I had the opportunity back in August of 2018 to visit the railroad front. Next slide. I've had an ongoing correspondence with a gentleman named Alexi who lives in Archangel and is a student of the Russian Civil War. He's very conversant with all the fighting that took place in that region during the Russian Civil War, and he goes out to the former battle sites and does what he calls military archaeology at those areas. So we struck up a correspondence over the years, and he had been inviting me for many years to come and visit. So I finally took him up on his offer in August of 2018 because of it being the centennial year. I figured if I didn't go then, I might never get there. So here we are getting off the railroad line right there alongside of where the battles were fought. This is at verse 445. And not much has changed in that area other than they've double tracked the railroad and they've electrified it. So if you want to get off there, you just tell the conductor in advance you want to get off at verse 445 and they let you out. There's no platform there. It's a long step down and long step back up. This is a trench, the remains of a trench at the front lines. Those trees you see there have grown since this 100 years ago. Back then that was all open area so that they could see the enemy and direct their fire accurately. But the area was depopulated during the farm collectivization era under Stalin. So not many people live in that area, and the war debris is still there pretty much as it was left in 1919 when the British finally evacuated. Next slide. Next slide. That's me standing in one of the trenches. It's one of my grandfather was stationed at the front lines on the railroad front, so undoubtedly he also used that trench at one time. It's still there 102 years later. Next slide. This lady is from the Archangel area, and I was introduced to her. Her grandfather also fought there, but he was in the Bolshevik Red Army. So she has an interest in this too, and she came with us to the front lines, and she's actually getting ready to crawl into the remains of a bunker underneath a blockhouse. The blockhouse is gone. It was stripped of the wood, but the dugout underneath of it, which the men would use for shelter during a bombardment, artillery bombardment, it's still there. And the next slide shows you what it looks like today. It's still perfectly preserved. Next slide. The man kneeling there with the metal detector, that's Alexi, and he's showing a piece of shrapnel to another gentleman who accompanied me. His name is John Yopp, Y-O-P-P. His father, not grandfather, but his father was a soldier in Company M of the 339th. And when he found out I was going, he asked if he could tag along because he was planning to go 2 months after I went. So we all went together in August while the weather was better. And so he was learning a lot from Alexi that day. Next slide. John's now got the metal detector, and literally you can find shrapnel, bullets, canteens, cups, barbed wire, every foot. And this area where we're standing was an area where there was a lot of heavy artillery bombardments, so there's shrapnel everywhere. Next slide. While we were there, we took a trip upriver or downriver to the concentration camp that was built by the British while the Americans and British were in the area. The communist era back in the 50s, one of the main buildings of that prisoner of war camp was turned into a museum. And this was a photo taken inside what used to be the museum, which today is abandoned. It's dark, dirty, gloomy. The floorboards are rotting, but all the displays are still intact, just as they were left back in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Next slide. This is what the Allied cemetery looks like in Archangel today. As I mentioned, the Americans had been removed from the cemetery, but the British has a policy that they do not return their war dead. They maintain them in cemeteries all over the world. And so they provide the funds to keep this cemetery maintained in Archangel to this day. Next photo is Alexi in his little museum. He's collected a lot of the artifacts from the battlefields and displays them for educational purposes, because they don't teach this anymore in the schools since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Prior to that, every school child knew about this story of the era when the Americans invaded Russia and fought their soldiers on Russian soil, but not so much today. So Alexi does his best to keep the stories of this intervention alive. And the last picture is me and Alexi getting ready to say goodbye at the end of my 10 days in Archangel. So the final slide, the next slide is a photo of a sunset on the Divinia River. You get some mighty colorful sunsets up there in the high latitudes. Archangel is about the same latitude as Fairbanks, Alaska. So you get some nice views up there. So that concludes the story of the polar bears of World War I. A very little known story, but a story that's important in the history of Michigan. And I think if there's anyone that has questions that's watching on Facebook, you can submit that from your screen. But if you're watching on YouTube, if you want to submit a question or follow up later on, this is my email address, mike@grobbel.org, and you can submit a query now or later, and I'll do my best to answer it. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to thank Mike, for bringing this really fascinating, overlooked historical event to KDL. So thank you so much for joining us, and for everybody out there that's watching. This is going to be archived, and so you can see it on our Facebook page in the future, and you can see it on our YouTube channel also. So I know that I'm going to be watching this again, and I hope you do too. So thanks a lot, Mike. This has been just really wonderful. And I hope you can come back in the future and do it live.
I'd be glad to.
Well,
thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much.